Okay, the Teaman is here, and I am here with Samurai Dan. Now, Samurai Dan, should I call you Samurai Dan or something else?
You can call me whatever you want.
Okay, good looking. Um, let's keep it to Dan just for speed.
Sure.
So I'm going to begin by telling you my initial impressions. When I first went to your panel, I don't know what you call it, I think it was Real Sword Piece of Crap, I think it was the first one I ever went to yours. I expected to hate you.
Well, the name of the panel is actually kind of it's challenging that way. There are conventions that don't want me to do that panel because it sounds negative, and they're afraid the sword vendors at conventions will be against that panel because I'll be bashing on their products. And that's not what it is at all. It's just a way to identify what could be a valuable sword versus something that's a great sword, but it's designed to be a decoration. And I chose the panel name just because it does get attention. I can see why you would think you were going to hate me if you saw the panel and then saw me, because I am pretty.
Yeah.
But no.
Well, the initial reason is because I do martial arts as well. I've done it for a long time now, and I take it, as some people might say, too seriously. And so I have had quite the issue of seeing people explain things poorly, or make dojos, or people who are just kind of reading from a script. And pretty much any time besides you that I see martial arts and comedy, I'm expecting for them to just make a joke out of everything. But after you began speaking, I realized that, holy crap, he's not just making jokes, he actually has an idea of what's going on. I cannot believe this. Somebody who I'm actually learning from. It's been too long since I've had that experience. I'm not sure if you've ever seen any of the Japanese cultural centers, not montages, but any of their panels and whatnot. I've been left thoroughly unimpressed, to say it nicely. I don't think there's ever been one in which I've stayed. In fact, we went to one yesterday for a tea ceremony. This is an anime and tea YouTube channel. And how long did we last? Like 7 minutes?
It was more like 15.
So as somebody who takes martial arts way too seriously, I appreciate that you're actually teaching and not just wasting everybody's time and they don't realize it.
Thank you. That means a lot. We do have difficulty getting into some conventions because they don't. If you haven't seen what we do or heard me speak before, people assume that they can just bring in somebody from a local dojo and they do the same things. And everyone's a little bit different. I try very hard not to say negative things about individuals, but I will be very specific, as you know, on incorrect technique or concepts, because those are going to lead to someone getting hurt. And I don't do that. And I do have a oversized sense of humor. My instructor, who's from Japan, hated watching a demonstration where I was joking and talking to the audience, and yelled at my wife about it, said I was a clown and that samurai were serious. And she explained to him that I take the art serious. It's me that I don't take serious. So when you watch what we do and when you listen, it's important that people pay attention and realize the techniques they're seeing are very real, and the combat application is razor edge, spot on, and very diligently trained and prepared for a performance. And the humor and the comedy is aimed at making fun of me or select people in the audience like you that I know are tough enough to take it and not get too upset, and not aimed at making the art itself frivolous. It's something, if you watch Jackie Chan movies, Jackie Chan is hysterically funny, but he's also very respectful, and his martial skills at this point in his career are beyond reproach or questioning. When people first saw him, in this country, they kind of worried about that and wondered, but he mixes funny and comedy with being a phenomenal martial artist. And I've kind of used that as an example and a blueprint, because if there's no audience, what we're teaching and what we do doesn't carry on to the next generation.
To give people an idea, give us some of your qualifications, not just for martial arts, but this field of defense and combat in general, to let people know just, you're not a one-trick pony.
I've been training in martial arts officially since 1991, so 28 years. I started doing full contact kickboxing, karate in Longview, Texas, when I was working armed security in the projects in East Texas. So in addition to learning how to protect myself on the dojo, I was learning to protect myself in what at the time, since U.S. Steel had just gone belly up in the late 80s and early 90s, East Texas was kind of a mess and a crime zone. And I worked armed security there for the projects and for rap musicians doing auditions. I fit in really well. Tall, skinny white guy. But as far then for martial history, I have Fourth Dan in Toyamaru, which is Japanese military sword, and also in Shinkendo, which is Toshishiro Obata's sword art, who was in the first two Ninja Turtle movies, and a third Dan in Aiki Bujitsu, and a Shodan in Bojitsu Tanrendo, which is bow and polearm training. And I teach Muay Thai kickboxing and spent 6 years training in Junfan Jeet Kune Do. So I teach Muay Thai kickboxing. And in case that's not violent enough or enough background, I'm also an NRA shooting instructor, and I teach tactical courses and self-defense courses and certify people for their carry conceal permits. And I'm also a competitive shooter doing IPSEC.
So as you can see, he's got quite a lot of experience in this field, and a lot of it involves cutting out the bullcrap. Like I said, that's one of the things I noticed, that there was no annoying fluff. So going a little bit away for now from the combat stuff, how long have you been doing anime conventions like this?
I've been doing anime, I think this is 2019, just for reference on. I believe we've been doing this for 17 years. It may not be quite that long, but there was a local anime convention just down the street from our dojo called Anime Iowa. And I had no idea what it was, but I had students that were anime fans, and they talked me into doing a martial arts exhibition for this convention. And I showed up, and there were kids running around in costumes and furry things, and there was a tremendous amount of enthusiasm for this. And we went out and just did a martial arts show, and another convention chair from Kansas was at our show, watched what we did, and invited us to come perform at their convention. And it just kind of grew out of that, where we travel 30 weekends out of the year performing at anime cons. And I still don't know anything about anime. I know that's terrible, but I was very disappointed when I did hear that anime was Japanese cartoons. I'm old. I grew up on Bugs Bunny and Roadrunner. I thought anime was just the Japanese version of Bugs Bunny and Roadrunner. And let's just say it's much more sophisticated and varied. And it's pretty amazing.
But you have 2 kids, and they're both into anime, so have they given you any help in understanding this strange new land every time you step in it?
My children have put up with me their whole lives, and they have learned that there are certain things that you can teach Dad, and there are certain things you can't. You can help him learn how to program his new VCR and his remote and things like that. But anime is just too complicated, apparently. And it's funny that both of my children are into anime because it's independent of us performing, because we would also perform at community colleges and other colleges and doing cultural centers for Japanese things where there is no humor. It's very serious and straight on. And so we would perform anywhere we could to help spread the knowledge of samurai arts and to keep it alive. And I didn't make there were no expectations on the kids on what I wanted them to learn or not learn or be interested in, not interested in. And for both of them to be anime fans is actually kind of funny, because now I don't know anime, but I know a lot of the voice actors, and they're friends of mine. I don't know their characters. And my children will be like, this is my favorite anime, and this is my character, and oh, this is the person's name. And then find out that it's a good friend of mine. And my kids freak out. We actually had Chris Ayers from Dragon Ball Z. He's, I think, Frieza. He's a good friend of mine, and he came to our house because he was at Anime Iowa one year, so we went to our house for dinner, and my son got to drive him. And all he knew was that this was Chris. He was a guest for the anime convention. And so he's driving him to the house in the car, and they start talking, and my son's like, so what are you in? And it turns out Chris was in his favorite show and was one of his favorite characters. And I think my son almost went off the road. He's like, I can't believe it. I'm in the car with Frieza. And Chris is like, no, you're in the car with Chris. But it's funny because my daughter does that now too.
So as somebody who's also been doing a lot more anime conventions, doing vending stuff, I can definitely say that it's not a pleasant thing, but it sounds like you do a lot more than me. You want to talk about some of the unseen hardships of doing all of this roadside travels and all of that?
That's actually a tougher question than I was expecting it to be. I had to do a double take. Sorry for the big.
How do you like puppies and kittens?
I love puppies and kittens, especially with barbecue sauce. The hardships for traveling, I'm very fortunate that most of the time when I travel, my wife gets to go with me. And so we take turns driving, and that eases the time on the road immensely. And the lonely times when you're not on stage and not performing, you need downtime in your hotel room. But sometimes it's kind of lonely. Having your wife there with you, it's almost like we're getting paid to go on vacation in a variety of places. And I really feel that way. I love performing, and I really enjoy traveling. My wife does a very good job of taking care of the social calendar and making sure when we go places that we'll visit local scenery and do things. Like here in Chicago, every year when we come for ASIN on Sunday, we go to Mitsuwa, the Japanese grocery store, and
I used to work there, actually.
figures. You get around, Julian.
Yeah, I did that. Medieval times. I've been...
Really?
It used to be, or it was gonna be a night. Then after about 2 months, they were basically short on nights, so they put me on the fast track, which meant about 10 to 12 hours a day of grueling, difficult work, riding the horses, swinging the giant mace. I was gonna be the giant mace guy. And I was doing I was trying to also do my martial arts. So from 10 a.m. to 10:30 p.m., repeat that 6 days a week. Training the 7th day just wasn't gonna last. And, yeah.
Did you know Tim? Tim's a staffer here, but he works at Medieval Times as well, and actually took us to that place, I think, either 2 or 3 years ago.
Well, for me, it was back in 2007, straight out of high school.
Oh, so a long time ago.
Yeah,
Okay.
they actually recruited me. I went with a friend for the high school graduation party for Medieval Times, and they came up to me and was like, hey, do you have a job by chance? No, sir.
Wow.
Yeah.
They didn't try to recruit me.
You need a little bit longer hair, I think.
Ow. Probably true. I used to have long hair. I still had the 80s hair after the 80s was over. Mm-hmm. And then when my daughter became a teenager, baldness happened very quickly. And now that she's not a teenager anymore, I'm hoping it'll grow back.
So one of the parts of your comedy is that you tend to be kind of offensive from time to time, but in a way that I appreciate. It's funny, but things have gotten a little bit, let's say, sensitive nowadays. Have you had to toe the line a little bit more? Have you gotten in more trouble than you've noticed? Has there been any issues with the way that you do comedy? Because I've noticed you're very specific nowadays, like, gender equality, I understand. Please don't kick me out. What have you noticed behind the scenes the past couple of years with that?
Well, honestly, let's deal with on stage first and then behind the scenes second. On stage, the advantage I have doing live performances is that people have a chance to see you and hear you. And beyond that, since it's in person, they can feel you. There's a presence. It's like the difference going to a rock concert in person versus watching it on TV. There's a different experience. And when people are in a room with me, I can tease people and make insensitive jokes and get away with it because people know, they can sense that I care about them. I mean, everyone. I did go to Bible college. I worked in a rescue mission. I'm not against anyone at all. There are actions that I'm against, not people. There are things that need, and being able to make jokes. It's really tough as a comedian because in our society today, people can get offended by anything. If you say something, they can get offended by it. If you don't say something, they can get offended by the fact that you didn't say anything. We kind of live in a world that right now, because of the overwhelming mass media and social media explosion that we haven't had time to grow into this technology yet, that we're kind of out of control, honestly. I feel where things are taken too far, where a good idea, and this one will get me in trouble, but when the anti-bullying campaign came out several years ago, I was completely in favor of it because that is not something that I tolerate well. Growing up small and really skinny, I was bullied a lot.
Yeah. I was in the same way. I was giving a little bit too much away. I was nearly driven to suicide because of bullying. It was that bad for me up until I found out that beating up the bullies really helped clear them out. So I also have experience in this line of thought, and I think I know where you're going with this. Continue.
Okay, so being absolutely against bullying and doing panels about it and teaching self-defense classes and everything, I was all in favor of the anti-bullying campaign. But what happened was it took on a life of its own, where instead of just simply trying to get people to not be hurtful and unkind, we took it too far where we are now more bullying than we ever have been, and intolerant and mean and divisive, and less able to take criticism, or to, if someone makes fun of you, we don't know how to react to it. I grew up with the whole, and I know it's a tired phrase, but the sticks and stones may break my bones, but names can never hurt me. You've been training in martial arts for a long time. So have I. One of the first things you learn when you train is what hurts and what doesn't. And then you learn what damages and what doesn't. And then, because there are lines there and categories. And as a trained martial artist, something that does not hurt you is not something that you're allowed to react to. People say something horrible about me, I'm not going to overreact to that because it didn't hurt me. And responding is going to be inappropriate. I feel like we've kind of lost that, where people are way too sensitive and will get all upset and just freak out about things. And so I do have to be careful with that on stage. And again, as long as it's in person, I have not had a problem with it. I have had a problem at a convention where it was being live streamed, and this is a huge, horrible thing now. I misgendered a friend of mine, someone I'd known for 6 years, and was a friend, out to dinner, recommended for conventions, all kinds of things, and just recently has come out as male. And this was something, I do not have a problem with it. People have a right to be who they are, but it wasn't a pronoun I was used to using. And I was on stage helping run, of all things, a charity auction. And I messed up and I referred to my friend as her. And it was being live streamed. And people apparently got really, really offended. And I understand it's a sensitive issue, but at the same time, I would like to point out that I've been referred to as female repeatedly by people who were trying to be hurtful, somehow calling me, my wife and I, referring to us as Samurai Jillian and Lady Dan. If genders are equal, there's no insult there. And if I don't identify as female, someone else's opinion doesn't change who I am or what I am. There's no real reason to be offended by it. And so you do have to be careful about those things.
So for any of those following this YouTube channel who've also followed us on Facebook and has wondered what's happened with the collective a few years back, a story which you might enjoy, is on our Facebook, we posted an article from some guy calling tea a disgusting, bland, boring thing. And since I own an anime-themed tea business, I posted that saying, "Who wants to join me in a lynch mob?" That's like a joke. And I think you can see where this is going.
Yeah.
And so some people got overly offended and began to insult us, saying they'll never buy from us again. I have records of who bought from us. You never did. Who are you kidding? And they ended up calling a place which we had a tea set up called The Collective, which was, it's got a little bit, you can tell by the name, but yeah, and so they just flat out kicked us out. No warning, no nothing, cancel the contract. Luckily, that worked out in our favor because we were losing money with them. But let's say it wasn't. Let's say I was, making money with this thing, I pay this guy right here, somebody who you're not hearing. I pay other people, my artist, and I'm trying to open up a physical store. They could have ruined all of that. They could have ruined other people's income because of something so petty.
Right.
It's like, I am an East. The main thing was in America, this is, it's got a history. I'm an Eastern European living in America who practices a Chinese way of life, Taoism, who does an Okinawan martial arts, who is associating with a Japanese cartoon. I have things I can draw from. I'm sorry if this American thing doesn't work. Please don't take away my livelihood. And so I've been worried with you, because please don't hit him. He's funny. Don't be.
I say challenging things. I do. And just so we're clear, I didn't go to a bad place when you said who's up for a lynch mob. Mm-hmm. I'm an 80s hair band guy, and the lead guitar player for a band called Dawkin was George Lynch, and he went and put together his own band, and they were the Lynch Mob. And I have their first album.
Yeah. Well, for me, it never occurred to me, racism, I'm not even...
That's so... Do you understand people were... Being lynched just simply meant you were hung. Mm-hmm. In the West, in the 1800s, that was the standard for execution. It had nothing to do with race at all. It was simply... A lynch mob was a crowd of people taking justice on themselves and hanging someone like a cattle thief without benefit of a hearing with a judge. And they had traveling judges. There was no racial basis for that. Did it happen to people of different races? Yes, it did. But it's not restricted to that. I mean, I don't want to be hung by a rope, regardless of what color I am, or gender, or ethnic background. Or we're so busy looking to be offended that we get offended at things that no offense was intended. Ever. And I worry about that. So you're right. I do say things that can get me in trouble. But at the end of the day, people who are going to be offended by me, I'm assuming right then and there that they don't know who I am. And they don't realize that no matter what they do to me, or what they say, or how mad they are, or what they try to do to hurt my livelihood, or post hurtful things online, when I leave this convention, if they're pulled over on the side of the road with a flat tire and it's raining out, I'm still going to be the guy that stops to help change their tire. And if they're going to hate me for that anyway, that says so much more about them than it does me. And you do the best you can.
One of the things that happened a few years back is you're also an author, and you had what you thought was going to be a fantastic book deal happening, and unfortunately, things went bad. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, and say how where you are now with all that? Because I'm also kind of curious. It's been a few years since I've asked.
I'm willing to talk about it. Several years ago, I wrote my first complete, full horror novel. I wrote about werewolves, because you're supposed to write about what you're passionate about.
And I've got a signed copy.
I love werewolves and motorcycles. So I wrote a novel about an outlaw motorcycle gang that were werewolves in Texas. And I had we self-published a few copies to start taking to conventions, since we travel so much, in the hopes of meeting a small publisher and trying to get a deal. And while we were in Virginia at an anime convention, one of the other guests there had just started his own publishing company and supposedly had worked for, I think he said Pigeon, might have been Tor Forge, but I'm pretty sure it was Pigeon. But he was a guest at that convention as a publisher and his publishing company. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't like him. We didn't get along very well. He was one of those people that just thought the world rose and set on him and turned everything into, I did this. And we did several panels together. And at the end of the weekend, he asked for a copy of my book to look through it, because he just found out that I'd written one. And he handed it to one of his editors and said, "Here, skim through this, tell me what you think." And at the end of the weekend, Sunday night, the editor came back and said, "You got to sign this guy." And I'm like, yeah, whatever. But we talked over the phone for a couple weeks and ended up signing a 5-year, 4-novel contract with this guy. and we were at the point the book was ready to be put into print, and we were actually at Katsucon in Washington D.C., and we were being taken on a tour of the White House where we had our phones off. And when we got out, we're in the parking lot and turned the phones back on, waiting to get back on the bus. I had a message from my publisher saying, I just walked out of a meeting with the Hudson Group. They own all the bookstores in airports around the country and several in Europe. And so I just walked out of a meeting with the Hudson Group. They just bought 50,000 copies of your first novel. I will be flying out to Iowa to give you your first commission check. It'll be a bit. And so it was life-changing because I had a 4-novel deal in my first one. I mean, nobody makes money writing, and no one's first novel. I mean, statistically, it's almost impossible. And so we did the whole, are you sure? How did this work? What is it? And he's like, look, you're the writer. I'm the publisher. You did your job. Let me do mine. Don't ask questions. And he kind of shamed me into not pushing too much. I knew little bits and peripheral stuff. And so he kept me updated for the next couple months. But eventually, what came down is he sent me a certified check from Federal Express. It was insured. For our my first commission check was $169,900. It was why he opened a small publishing company of his own, was the authors at a regular publishing deal don't make very much. But that was my first check. The only problem was it was post-dated, which businesses you can't do. You used to be able to get away with it as a personal check. You write them a check and say, here, hold this for a week and then cash it. But my check was post-dated. And then the day before I was supposed to be able to cash it, I got an email saying, don't cash your check. There's a problem. We're going to have to go back and have more meetings. And he played me along for 3 months, lie after lie. And I finally took it on myself to contact the Hudson Group myself, and they'd never heard of him. It was all lies for a guy who wanted to feel important. And he had several other. I took a lot of grief when I went public on this, where people thought I was trying to scam people and trying to generate false sympathy. But I didn't like him at the convention, and so I went to 4 different people in the industry that he said he'd worked with before. And they're all decent-sized names in the anime community, and all 4 of them backed him up. They all said they'd worked with him before. 2 of them had deals with him for their own books, and so I signed on with him. And then he wanted me writing full-time, so we cut back on my convention schedule. And once you start cutting back, it's kind of hard to open doors again. So we suffered from the fewer cons and other things. And so when we found out it was a fraud, I could either, I had gotten in financial trouble because the check didn't clear. And I could either file Chapter 11 bankruptcy, or we could do a GoFundMe or a thing as a way that if people wanted to donate to try to help, they could. And if they didn't want to, they didn't have to. I had issues with Chapter 11 bankruptcy because the creditors then just wouldn't have gotten their money, and I just would have walked away from it. And I owed, and I wanted to pay that. So we did the fundraiser as a way of helping with that, and also to bring attention to what happened, because once somebody got a hold of it out in the West Coast, and they're a writer for a CW show, she also does a blog, and she's not very nice to people. Mm-hmm. And she never contacted me or talked to me at all, but she wrote a horrible, vicious, insulting blog, and the people that read her blog jumped on with all these comments and were really nasty about it. And the other 4 people that wanted me initially to use their names as well so we could put a stop to this all contacted me and asked me to not drop their names. And it's okay if they ever hear this and get their feelings hurt. They just left me hanging on that, and I still won't name them, but they left me hanging out to dry where I was the only one publicly that came forwards. So for a while there were conventions that thought that I was a fraud, and in the 5 years it's been since that happened, time has proven me to be, I'm still here, still doing my thing, and they're run out of the community completely for other scams that they've been doing. A good friend of mine, voice actor, was going to do the audiobook for my first novel, and when he found out that that it wasn't happening, he took my book to a publishing agent friend of his and showed it to him, and the guy had a second meeting with him and said, "This is good. I want to talk to him." So I was very close to flying out to New York to meet with this big time publisher, and when my friend told him what had happened, the guy said, "Whoa, stop." One of the scams in the publishing industry is you get somebody that signs a book deal, and then they don't actually deliver. They don't do their part. So the author goes and gets published somewhere else, and then the fraud company will sue the legitimate publisher for breach of contract. And even if they don't win, they'll take all the profitability out of that book by tying it up in legal fees. They said, "We can't touch him until his first contract is up, even if it's a fraud. So have him write something else, and we'll see him in 5 years." Which is horrible, but that was last July. So I'm now free and able to pursue more things. So the first novel we just self-published and put out, and the sequel has been done for 4 years, and we've held on to it. It will be out by Christmas.
Excellent.
We're finishing the artwork for it, and then it'll be out by Christmas, and we're working with a new artist for a new ongoing series that I'm almost done with the first novel on, that hopefully will be out in the spring.
Bring this a little bit more cheerful. This past few comics have been more on the serious side. Give us an idea of the mindset that you and the family go through with writing new skits, writing new ideas for panels, all of that stuff. Because it seems like every year you have at least one new one.
We try, Anime Central is kind of a big event for us. So every year we try to bring at least one new event to Anime Central, and then we'll add it to our list of events that we'll do at other conventions. But so many of the things we do are from off-the-cuff comments that just happen kind of in the moment. And a lot of them they're based on feedback from attendees. People ask questions, especially after a panel, about specific things, and I'll realize that that's a good idea to do an entire panel on. The real sword or piece of crap that you went to the first time was based on trying to teach my students how to recognize a sword, if like at a garage sale, or if they had a buddy that had a blade that his grandpa brought back. It was things that I tried to teach my students to be able to look at, and since they have more time, because they train with you, they have more time to absorb more things and more knowledge. I wanted to kind of distill it down to 5 easy reference points that anybody could remember. And that's where that panel came from. Now it gets a little more challenging because we've been doing this for a while, and so many of what you would consider the basics for martial arts, for different things you want to do, have been covered. So it gets a little bit more challenging to come up with ideas, and luckily my children are really supportive of what we do, and they're still embarrassed by me. Most people who know me are, but they take it really well. And it's funny, my daughter and my son both do really well with little snarky comebacks that are spot on stage. But it's been amazing how many of the jokes and fun parts of my panels are just things my children have said in response to me being, well, me.
One of the things I've noticed is that, especially here, walking down the halls, coming to the hotel room to do this interview, is even though it's staged, you're not really putting on an act. You're kind of just doing what you would normally do anyway, and it just so happens to be the show. Like the martial arts, has like a nice, genuine feel to it. So one of the things that plagued you about 2 years ago, I think, is you got a not-so-fun diagnosis. Good old type 2 diabetes. How has that affected your training, convention stuff, the nice little puppy, all of that?
Type 2 diabetes is a serious thing, and I don't mean to downplay its significance at all, because I believe after heart disease, diabetes is the number 2 cause of early death in this country. Just diabetics and diabetes in general. Type 1 is clearly the more serious, but type 2 diabetes, for me, it's really not that big a deal. Most people can combat type 2 diabetes with modified diet and exercise. And I'm a martial arts instructor who doesn't like dessert. So That's not even an issue. My doctor said that I probably have been diabetic for 5 years previous to that,
Oy.
but I didn't know because of the lifestyle. The way we found out was I got a concussion and got laid up for 2 months and sat in the dark. We couldn't watch TV, couldn't listen to music, couldn't read. You basically just sat and stared at the wall. And so while I wasn't moving and being active, it caught up to me where my blood sugar went really high. And when we finally tested it, we got in, they're like, oh, yeah, you're diabetic.
Do you remember what the number was?
Oh, yeah. We had just gotten to Anime Milwaukee in February, and I was really not feeling well. So my wife went to Walmart and bought the little meter, stabbed me in the finger, which I still think was the whole reason for this. She just wanted to be able to stab me and get away with it. Stabbed me in the finger, took a blood sample, and my reading was 583.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it's almost coma level. And normally your doctor will tell you if you test and you're that high, you go to the emergency room. Well, I didn't want to do that. That's money, and I don't have money. And plus, we weren't at home. We were in Milwaukee. So we just immediately cut anything that had any carbs at all to work it down. And then when we got back from the convention, I went in to the doctor. So it's a serious thing, but the biggest thing I've noticed as a martial artist, type 2 diabetic, you need to eat every 4 hours. And I have an addictive personality. If I start working on something, I'll go 12, 13 hours at a stretch without even noticing the clock has moved. I get into things and I work, and I can't do that anymore because my blood sugar will crash. And that's another reason why I have helpers at conventions, is that it's their job to make sure that I keep eating because I'm always moving and talking. And so I have that. And I have Kiba. I have an amazing medical alert service dog. He'll be 2 years old next month, and he's still technically he's in training. He's trained enough to pass all of his tests, but you can't be a fully vested service dog until you're 2. And so he's waiting on his final certification until he's old enough. But he's been trained by my wife, this is her 4th service dog to train. And that means that we got to bring him home in 8 weeks. And we're never getting rid of him. He's my dog. And he's been unbelievable. I get frustrated because if I'm working on something, especially if I'm sitting down, if my blood sugar level starts getting too low, he will come and he'll just start messing with me. He'll paw at my leg, and then he'll put his head in my lap, which I have a laptop there. It's already occupied, and he's like, his head fills the whole thing. And he'll start climbing on me, and he'll climb up on my lap and start licking my head. He's 100-pound Akita. When he gets in my lap, because I'm ignoring him, I'm like, go away, I'll put you outside. He doesn't want out. He's reacting to me. And I'll get mad, and I'll call my wife, say, the dog will not leave me alone. She's like, what's your blood sugar level? I'm like, what difference does it make? I feel fine. She's like, you're being grumpy. I'm like, all right, fine, I'll check. That dog is never wrong, ever. He even alerts on other people, which is amazing and funny. But he'll get after me, and as soon as I go get something to eat, he'll just leave me alone. And he's gotten to a point in his training where, with pattern recognition, if he's pestering me, if I reach for my blood tester, he'll just go lay down because he knows that was his job and that I'll take care of it. And that means I get to take him everywhere. He gets to fly. He goes to restaurants. And he's amazingly well behaved and popular at conventions. He has his own panels. But he's my boy.
How do you respond to allegations that you love your wife?
Guilty. Guilty as charged. I do love my wife, and she's amazing. She is so underappreciated and overlooked as just kind of being the one behind the guy with the big mouth. But it's her job to keep track of everything. She handles all the social parts of the conventions and feeding me and taking care of the dog and juggling the merchandise and doing all of these things. And she went to a convention. We were double booked one weekend, and I went with a helper to one convention, and she took one of our students to another convention to be her helper. And Jill tried her best to do everything that I do and everything she normally does, so it wasn't overwhelming for her new helper. And she reduced her to just a quivering mass of Jell-O, basically. And when I got back the next night at the dojo, my student came up to me and said, I don't know what you pay your wife for going to conventions, but it's not enough. She's amazing, and I can't believe she does that much work all the time. And I just looked at her and said, what are you talking about? She goes, I had to do her job, and it killed me. And me being me, selfish and stuck up and male chauvinist pig, I just looked at her and said, wait, what about the job I do? She's just my assistant, which my wife heard.
Oh.
And then I don't remember anything after that. I woke up 3 weeks later. No, I'm just absolutely kidding. My wife is so graceful and kind and good-hearted with people. I think that also goes a long way in me being able to make the jokes and things that I do, is people watch her for her reactions. And when they see her and how graceful she is and how kind she is and how she's always mock offended at me and then laughs and cuts up and contributes to it, it gives me props.
All right. Do you have any closing thoughts for the people listening in on this?
Come to more conventions. It's good for you, and if you attend, I will more likely get hired because there's more people there.
And as a guy who is incredibly stuck up and only likes the highest quality of stuff, like my tea, which you can find at dragonstreasure.com, I do personally highly recommend checking out Samurai Dan. You will learn something, and if you don't, well, that's on you. Thank you for your time, Samurai Dan.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.